You're watching India Ahead, and I'm Aditya Nathnarayanan. So, in the past couple of weeks, all of you must be hearing the terms 5G, C-band. Might not, but it could be possible that not everyone knows what they actually stand for. But how does it impact the consumers? If you know that in the past couple of weeks, we have seen several cancellations of airlines traveling to United States of America. The passengers are taking a hit. Many are flights are being rescheduled, many flights stand cancelled, and there have been a lot of buzz and a lot of talk about 5G and C-band. And on today, we have experts who are joining us on the panel because while we're talking about the civil aviation industry and how 5G C-band can interfere with the communication system in aircrafts, there is another key industry which is not being talked about today, especially when it comes to 5G and C-band. That is the broadcasting industry. Now, over the past couple of months, even in India, the broadcasting industry has raised a lot of red flags over the appropriate use of 5G or the latest entry in this technical term, which is the C-band. How does it impact India? What is the solution thereafter? And what is the problem right now? And to discuss that, joining us on the panel and on India Ahead right now is Amitabh Kumar, who's the head of Broadcast Operations Engineering of Zee Network. We have Rajiv Gambhir, Senior Director, Technology and Policy, Satcom Industry Association. And we are also joined by Gaurav Kharod, Managing Director of Sales, Intelsat. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us here on India Ahead. Mr. Amitabh Kumar, let me start by you. While we've been hearing this, we have seen many articles on it. We have seen the media and the press worldwide covering how a 5G is impacting civil aviation industry, especially when it comes to the United States of America. But when it comes to the broadcasting industry, what really are the issues, at least here in India, that the industry really is facing?
Well, actually, the 5G introduction is a very serious and, it has a deliberated matter in all the countries. The comparison of US and India are in many ways not really very correct. The fact is that the entire broadcast industry today operates in the frequency band, which is the C band, and more specifically, it is the band from 3700 to 4200 megahertz. As per the National Frequency Allocation Plan, the only frequencies which 5G could use are up to 3600, which means that they leave a 100 megahertz band where it's a no man's land, where nobody operates. And then after that, the broadcast band begins from 3700. So 3600 to 3700 is the band which should have been left for the filters or for the operations to be done carefully and accurately. Now, what is happening now is that the latest proposals go beyond the National Frequency Allocation Plan to auction the spectrum up to 3670 megahertz, which means leaving only 30 megahertz band, which is not enough to protect all the broadcast services that are operating in India. We have more than 800 channels. And these channels are very vital to the cable and satellite industry in India. They are the only ways in which the vast population in rural villages and everywhere else in India receives the TV channels, the TV signals. And once the 5G starts, we are going to have a severe interference in all the services randomly all across India, which means that somewhere it will be coming, somewhere you will get a pixelation, the channels will go off and on and so on. So it's a very serious matter. And more than 100 megahertz or roughly about 130 megahertz of bandwidth will be lost, which means that the space which is available for the operation of the broadcast services is severely reduced. And even in that band, there is going to be interference. So the broadcast industry, which is, more than 100,000 crores, is going to be deeply impacted. And that is one point that, is looming ahead for the industry. Whereas the same thing has been deliberated and carefully dealt with in the US, where they have provided the funds of more than $10.7 billion, which came out of the auction proceeds of $22.7 billion, which were given to the cable and satellite operators and the satellite providers so that they can launch new satellites which use the reduced band. So in India, nothing of the sort, has happened so far. And we don't see anything happening because the auctions, after will be happening in the next 1 or 2 quarters. So therefore, it's a very serious situation,
And also,
which
Mr. Kumar, because no one really is talking about the broadcasting industry at all. Because right now the focus primarily is on the civil aviation. Also raised concerns about how Mr. Kumar is talking about the 30 megahertz, being the gray area right now. But if you could make us understand for a layman, and when Mr. Amitabh Kumar says that it can interfere with the satellite system with 700 odd channels across, it can have a massive impact on the broadcast industry. He's talking about his space. I understand that. But for a layman, how do you make them understand how will it impact them? If I'm watching the television and if you're saying that there is any sort of interference that could happen, how does it impact the consumer?
Okay, thank you so much for having me here, first of all. And I'd love to hear my co-panelists also on this. But to come to your question, Amitabhji raised about the bogey of 30 megahertz of God band and how it will interfere. So it's important to understand what interference is and why just 5G. Why are we not talking of other things? You see, any two services which are ubiquitous in nature cannot be using the same frequency band. So that's a very important concept. And if you look at what the ITU definition of interference is, if an existing services, a communication service, if you can withdraw information without any degradation, in spite of presence of another service, then that is not interference. But if you are not able to withdraw the same information, or if there is a degradation in that due to another service, that's interference. And in the case of 5G, these are high power transmitters, and we are not talking one transmitter, we are talking multitude of them. So the interference is not what comes from one transmitter, it's the aggregate power which comes and interferes with other services. So coming back to your question on the television side, it is not just the 800, 900 channels that are impacted. It is the GDP contribution behind it. It's the employment generation behind it. It's a whole economy which will get impacted. So investments are already there. Today, satellite is a very invisible medium. When you watch your television, you don't realize that most of it is coming through a satellite to your television set, whether it's at your home, or even if you're watching on your mobile set, somewhere at the back end, that content is being transferred to a CDN, maybe through a satellite. Right? So satellites have a very important role to play in the complete broadcast ecosystem. However, any aggregate power which kinds of interferes and degrades this performance is going to impact the investment in these things. These satellites are there in the air, they're there in the space. You can't go and tune them. Now, the point is how much spectrum is required. So why from 3600 to 3670? You see, recently, in recent past, this has been a question with multiple nations. Ofcom in United Kingdom, they did some test. They built up a series of applications out of the 3GPP table. And they said, what if we run all these applications? So how much spectrum does a 5G operator need? And they came up with a number saying that at a 40 megahertz, almost all those applications, including autonomous cars, right, could be run with a 40 megahertz of spectrum per operator. Now in India, we have 4 operators, 3 of them in the private sector, 1 in the public sector. And those 3 operators have 90% market share. So 40 megahertz per each operator would be 120. Even if you give 40 to the other one, that's 160 megahertz. So between 3300 to 3600, we have 300 megahertz with a requirement of 160 megahertz. So I don't see a reason
Mr. Gambhir,
why
you have also more or less also spoken on the lines of what Mr. Amitabh Kumar is saying. And does that mean, Mr. Gaurav Kharod, that not enough consultation was made or not enough debate, enough was put in, the mind was put into place, especially when it comes to getting in the C-band here in India, while everyone is talking about the civil aviation industry, there were not much consultations vis-a-vis the experts or the stakeholders from the broadcasting industry?
So I wouldn't say that. I would say that the broadcast industry and the different government departments have been in touch. There have been consultations which have happened in the past. The US model has been scrutinized. The frequencies, as Mr. Amitabh said, the frequency range in the US is and how they operate the frequency range is different than in India. I think the government, the departments, they understand this. It's just a matter of clearing out the original capacity that was identified for 5G, which was the 3300 to 3600 megahertz slab, which is equal to 300 megahertz of total capacity available. Unfortunately, there are a few encumbrances on that particular block of 300 megahertz. But obviously, these are encumbrances which can be taken care of if there is a planned method of doing that. So as Amitabh said, instead of pushing the limit from 3600 to 3670, it might be a good idea to just look at the 300 megahertz block between 36 and use it for the 4 MNOs, which Mr. Gambhir very rightly said, as per the studies from UK, where the mobile operators in the UK wanted 80 megahertz. The government of UK said 40 is good enough for all your services. And if you still want more, you don't need to have it contiguous. You don't need to have it all together. You can have 40 here, you can have 20 somewhere else and 20 somewhere else and so on. So it need not be that all the 100 megahertz that someone is demanding or 80 megahertz someone is demanding has to come from this particular mid-band spectrum that we are debating here.
Okay, that's very interesting. Mr. Amitabh Kumar, let me bring you in again. So, from what all three of you are experts in this industry, you are saying that there is an option and there is a solution. So what best and what immediate solution do experts like you really recommend at this point in time? And do you think that is something that could be implemented with an immediate effect, or it probably would take a longer duration of time?
Well, I think, to begin with, the best option for the government is to look at two things. One is that they don't use the entire C-band till 3670 megahertz, but restrain it to about 3600 megahertz, which was the original plan. Number two, there are a number of other bands, which are in the, let's say, the millimeter wave bands. And while in the US, the 5G has been behind. I mean, it was launched about 3 years back when the millimeter wave bands were not really so populated, the devices were not available. That is not the case today. Today, most of the launches are happening in the millimeter wave band. So for the government, the second option is, apart from not using up to 3670, is to really go into the millimeter wave bands. India has been always ahead. We went for the GSM and not the older technologies. We were the first to do many things. So why not, move into this the millimeter wave bands, 26 gigahertz, 27 gigahertz, and have the devices which are already available, use them there. And the third thing is that, because the channels are going to be impacted in any case because of 5G, we need to allow the lower bit rates to be, taken on the channels based on high efficiency encoding. The Department of Telecom and the Government of India have been following a very, very antiquated standard where an HD channel, for example, it should have minimum 8 megabits, which was the case 20 years ago, when the encoders could be only MPEG-2 and they could provide channels of 8 megabits. Today, you can have with HEVC coding, you can go down to roughly 3.5 megabits, which means that you can double the number of channels which can be carried by the same C-band spectrum. So that is the second option, which the government must implement and do it on very high priority. So that's very important. And fortunately, all
right. So clearly, the government has options, as you're talking about, Mr. Amitabh Kumar. The government has options, and probably this is something the government should be talking about, discussing more, and work on a high priority, as you're mentioning. But Mr. Rajiv Gambhir, the next obvious question that arises, that who is going to be bearing all the cost of the tech solutions? Because, there's also a larger question of the precedents from other jurisdictions. So that also is a question that will arise in this particular scenario.
Yeah, but I'd like to add something to what Amitabh just said. You see, on the millimeter wave side,
Sure.
there is ITU has harmonized 3.25 gigahertz, which is 3,250 megahertz of spectrum for IMT. And the DOT is looking forward to not just auction that, but also another 2 gigahertz of spectrum, which is allocated to a part of that, which is allocated to the satellite and which is being harmonized across the world. So, which means that while the whole of Europe will not be using 28 gigahertz, in India, we are saying a part of that might be given to the IMT services. It is now you see what you do when at your home a child has not finished his first food and asks for a second. The answer is similar. You say no, right? So unless the existing spectrum, which is already identified and harmonized, can be utilized by the 5G operators, and trust me, I'm not saying 5G does not need to be here. We are fully in support. We have to move with the world. 5G needs to be here, and it needs to be fast. But why take a contentious route? Why say this road will have only one Rolls-Royce running and not the other ones? So why take a contentious route which takes away the livelihood of so many people from the broadcast sector and stifle and cripple the innovations which are coming up in the Wi-Fi and the satellite sector? So that's as far as the millimeter wave and the expansive requirements being projected for 5G are concerned. Certainly, those requirements are not there, and those are being projected. Coming to your
Mr.
question
Tharoor,
on the international scenario.
Okay, please.
Please. So you see,
complete
even in Hong Kong, they have 100 megahertz of guard band on C-band, right? Even other countries, there are examples of other countries who have done tests for coexistence, realize that coexistence is not possible, a certain amount of guard band is required, and most of the countries in the neighborhood in Asia Pacific are using 100 megahertz of guard band, which is required. An amount of guard band is required, and most of the countries in the neighborhood in Asia Pacific are using 100 megahertz of guard band, which is required, and more is required. There needs to be a PFD limit, power limit on the 5G transmitters. The mandate should be on the newcomer to ensure that the incumbent services are not impacted. Yeah, please.
All right. Mr. Tharoor, my last question to you would be that, is there a sense with your industry that the government so far has been silent on this issue?
I would say yes. I would say that as the co-panelists have said, there is a guard band issue here. The smaller the guard band, the more the implications for both sides, and especially more for the broadcasting side, because the power on the 5G industry, the power that they radiate is going to be far more. So what Mr. Gambhir was alluding was that the government needs to step in and say that, okay, if my guard band is 100 megahertz, then there are some filters and there are some power limitations that need to be drawn out for the 5G terrestrial towers and their installations. And that has not yet come out. If the guard band shrinks lower to 30 megahertz, then those power limitations would be more stricter, more stringent. The filter design that needs to be done for the satellite broadcasting receive stations would also need to be subsidized by the government. So in the US, the government of US did the auctions for 5G. From the auction proceeds, they subsidized all the filters. They put in the power restrictions of on all the 5G towers, etc. I think government of India needs to look into that seriously as to who is impacted here. The satellite industry definitely is impacted, and therefore they need to be helped. They were the incumbents, they were the primary users. They need to be helped through government mechanisms of providing filters, subsidizing them, etc. The other thing I must mention is what Mr. Gambhir was talking about, other countries. US is not a prime or a good example for India. Is why? Because US falls in a different region. The world is divided into 3 different regions by the ITU. The US falls in a different region, the Europe falls in a different region, and India and Asia fall in region 3. Now, under region 3, our benchmark should be countries within region 3 and countries which are geographically widespread, like China or or other nations which have similar populations. What are they doing in terms? So Singapore, for example, has a 50 megahertz guard band, but then they're only giving 200 megahertz of mid-band spectrum to the MNOs. Similarly, Hong Kong is giving 200 megahertz and their guard band is 100 megahertz. China is giving 300 megahertz because of the population and the geographical spread. But even in that case, their guard band is 100 megahertz. So similar to China, geographically, population-wise, I think that should be the model that we should look at. 100 megahertz of guard band. Government provides inputs on the limiting of power on the 5G stations. And government provides subsidy on.
And Mr. Gaurav Kharod, apologies for interjecting you here. We're also running out of time. But one thing is very clear from the expert opinions that is coming on from today's panel, whether it is from Mr. Amitabh Kumar or Mr. Kharod or Mr. Rajiv Gambhir, it clearly looks like that it is an issue that needs to be addressed with an immediate effect. There isn't any discussion about it going on, but clearly this industry, barring from the civil aviation industry, the broadcast industry has been raising those red flags for the past couple of months, and we are hoping that the government really listens to the experts and the stakeholders and works on it. And as many have been saying, that it should happen on immediate effect or on a priority basis. Thank you very much, Mr. Kumar, Mr. Gambhir, and Mr. Gaurav Kharod for joining me here on India Ahead. It was a pleasure for understanding a territory and a domain which no one really is talking about today. Thank you very much.